Díomh agus fáilteoireamh go léir chuig our Scóil na Déanaí Sóisialta. It's a great honor for me to address you here as National Chairperson. I had hoped that we might be able to do so in person, but while we remain in the digital space for now, the light ahead is visible and brighter all the time. The past 18 months have been a challenge for us in many different ways. We've struggled financially, with our health and mental health, with our working and living arrangements. We've had to contend with a massive tear in the fabric of our everyday lives. There's no denying that we will be living with repercussions of this pandemic for some time to come. COVID-19 and the resulting fallout has exposed the grave injustices in our society. Injustices that have always existed, but are now highlighted and visible to all. The cracks in our two-tier health system can no longer be papered over. The inequity of vaccine availability throughout the world shows the chasm that separates us from the global south. The precarious nature of housing in Ireland has become all the more obvious, as has the precarious nature of work for many. The spotlight was shone on the disproportionate burden that is placed on women and caregivers. This new reality has given us an opportunity to stop and consider the massive demands placed on us merely to exist and survive in the modern world, never mind to thrive. It is time to redress the balance in our lives and our surroundings. I'm reminded of a quote I came across recently by one of my favorite authors, Arundhati Roy. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks of dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Throughout the pandemic, I have been comforted by the physical changes I've noticed in my surroundings. The rare birds flocking to my garden, an abundance of bees and wildlife, the explosions of colour and rustling of life in the hedgerows. Nature is taking back her power, and the benefits to all of us are immeasurable. We can take this as an example to follow. We are entering a new cycle of growth in our society. We have been afforded an opportunity for a new way of doing things, a space to talk about a more just and fairer society and what that looks like for all of us. Our summer school is where those conversations continue to grow and where we hone our ideas and prepare to present them to society at large as a viable alternative. This is our chance to lead the way towards a more equitable society, a place where we treat everyone with compassion and no one is left behind. And I would like to introduce Councillor David Quinn, who is going to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sheila. My pleasure to introduce Dr. Ida Milne, who's going to present to us this evening. Dr. Milne has researched the social, medical, demographical, and political history of the 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic in Ireland for her PhD dissertation in Trinity College, Dublin. Her work on the pandemic has been published in many fora and media, but principally in her monograph, Stacking the Coffins, Influenza, War and Revolution in Ireland, 1918 to 1919, which was named a Choice Review's Outstanding Academic Titles of 2019. Dr. Milne has used her research on this earlier pandemic to inform discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic and has been a frequent media contributor during the current crisis. A member of the Royal Irish Academy Historical Sciences Committee, she's the chair of the European Social Science History Conference, Health and Environmental Strand. She's also a social historian of disease and of Irish Protestant identity and lectures in European history at Carlow College. So I'd like to hand over to Dr. Milne now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and to Sheila as well. I'm just checking now that you can see my screen because it's actually not coming in. Great, that's brilliant, thank you.
Well done, guys.
Sorry about that, my screen just kept freezing. So perhaps we just move on to the first slide there, the second slide there, if you could, please. So Terence Ranger and Paul Slack have theorized that pandemics or major epidemics cast a peculiarly bright light on the societies in which they occur, that they expose inefficiencies in things like healthcare and in environmental conditions like housing. And they argue that pandemics or major epidemics place pressure on existing healthcare and social systems and enlarge the cracks that are already there and show what needs to be changed. And I argued that in 1918, what it really did was create a huge big boiling pot of lots of inefficiencies and difficulties with the system. Irish healthcare was absolutely crumbling in 1918 with massive inflation during the war and with years of neglect and failure to invest. If you can put next slide on then, please. So historically, changes in health provision are driven or prompted by epidemics or pandemics. The plague gave us the concepts of quarantine, 40 days of isolation on people entering. It began originally with Dubrovnik in 1377 during the Black Death, which killed 1/3 of Europe's people. So in the 1600s, then Dubrovnik formalized the isolation in little houses, the lazarettos, just outside the city to isolate the ill or travelers in times of epidemics. Smallpox was really a game changer. It produced for the first time mass vaccination schemes, first of all variolation, and then with Edward Jenner, inoculation. Compulsory smallpox vaccination was introduced in Ireland and in Britain in the 1850s and continued right into the last century. In the 19th century, cholera became a global problem for the first time. There's been, I think, 7 pandemics of cholera around the world. And of course, it really affected us here during the Great Famine. And the game changer for that was when John Snow, the English physician in 1854, started mapping using the developing epidemiology science, cases around the Broad Street pump in Soho. And he was able to narrow it down to that one particular pump and to realize that cholera was really spread by dirty water and that clean water was the solution to not having outbreaks or epidemics of cholera. In Ireland, Snow's work was quite influential because shortly after that, in 1862, the Dublin Corporation brought under the impetus of Sir John Gray, who there's a statue to in O'Connell Street, and rightly so, the Dublin Corporation introduced waterworks, bringing the Vartry, clean water from the Vartry down into Dublin. And again, that was a game changer because it did a lot to reduce the death rate in Dublin. Another disease that caused epidemics was typhus, a louse-borne disease, generally associated, like the others as well, with times of famine or with war. It became really prominent, most famously, when Napoleon went into Russia and couldn't provide adequate water supply for his troops. There was a massive epidemic, actually bigger than the Great Flu, killed 100,000 people in Ireland in 1812 to 15. Conditions conducive to the spread of typhus also coincide with epidemics of plague, smallpox and cholera. So you often see them in syndemic conditions. Poor sanitation and a proximity to other humans is a key factor in its spread. And then again with typhus, studies from the Second World War, wartime conditions, were key to controlling it in military and civilian populations. The 19th century is a really important time from learning from epidemics to deal with future epidemics. As a result of the cholera epidemics, there was international cooperation, international sanitary conferences held in the 19th century to develop international communication on death by infectious disease. And this was also part of the growing concept of the statistical state, where you see people like William Farr in the UK and William Wilde here in Ireland using the census and death certification, which was introduced in Ireland in the 1860s then, to see where epidemics are killing people and to kind of be able to plan better and to look internationally to see where they're spreading and what do you do about it. And you also see in the 19th century the epidemics, the pandemics, the growth of towns and cities associated with the Industrial Revolution leads to an increasing focus on sanitation, on the importance of clean water for improving health, on removing dung heaps and cesspits, which even in the 1910s were very common in most towns in Ireland and in Dublin City as well, and of creating sewage system in urban areas. Next slide, please. That map is actually of the Broad Street Pump SNOWS map. So then let's look at my main research area, which is the 1918-1919 flu and COVID, to see how they compare, the two crises to compare, and is it actually useful to compare? Well, there are many echoes. You know, from the beginning of last year, when it began to emerge from Wuhan, I was looking, saying, oh my God, this just feels so the same. But am I being overexcited about this because it's my research field? Am I exaggerating in January last year when I said this is going to be a problem? And I was kind of relieved in a way to hear Sam McConkey echoing some of the estimates I was making about death based on 1918, 1919. And actually, he was even increasing the numbers of dead. There were 23,000 died from the flu in 1918. And at that stage, because we hadn't yet learned medically how to cope with COVID, it was killing a similar number of people, about 2% of all the cases, all the people who caught it. So based on that, Sam was actually estimating over 30,000 dead from this disease if we didn't learn how to manage it, which of course we have. So there are many echoes. It's a different but similar illness with respiratory and other symptoms. The global spread was very, very similar, running through the media. If you look through the newspapers in 1918, the titles often echo the same kind of captioning, etc. The social impact, the shutting down of society. In 1918, it wasn't usually done through quarantine, except in Australia. But society closed down naturally as people stayed at home, either because they were afraid of catching the disease or because they'd already caught it. The medical puzzle, of course, it's a new disease. How do we treat this? The political reaction. And every time you see that politicians are quite slow to step in to realize what's going on. And again, I think this is an area I'm very keen that politicians should study the history of epidemics and pandemics more often, because it was quite apparent that they hadn't. The overwhelming of health systems. In 1918, the systems were very much already overburdened by soldiers from the war in the Dublin hospitals, and they had to be cleared out in order to make space for the flu ill, and the large numbers of ill and dead, and the vulnerability of lower socioeconomic groups. There was also a long 1918 flu, just like long COVID. So it's not over yet. We don't know whether the scale of death, illness, and ongoing damage to human bodies will compare, but it obviously seems much less possible now as medicine's got a much better grip on it. But it still had 216 million cases globally, according to Worldometers today, and 4.5 million deaths. And that's more than the 1957 and 68 flu pandemics put together. Spanish flu killed upwards of 50 million, and its infection is estimated at 1/3 of the global population, which was then 2 billion. It's now 7 billion. So the numbers, you know, could be broadly much, much higher if it was on the same scale. But in some countries, and some surprising countries, COVID deaths are very close to the 1918-19 flu toll. For example, in America, where the COVID deaths today are at 651,958, which is just short of the 1918-1919 estimate of 670,000. Really surprising. Of course, again, a much bigger population than they had in 1918. So work of a group I'm part of, international 1918-1919 pandemic researchers, has been really put to many public uses in the last 18 months. One of the things I most enjoyed, I felt most valuable doing, useful doing, was actually talking to the Irish Army, their COVID task force. And I've spoken to many other medical groups throughout the year as well. But before this crisis emerged, our network, historians, historical demographers, science writers, geographers, etc., we'd been trying to raise awareness of the risks posed by pandemics amongst the public and amongst medical and government interests. So we really wanted, one of the things, that emerged from my own research and other people's research was the increased impact of pandemics on challenged sectors of society. So people in the poor, people in, say, nomadic conditions, people like the Inuit, in Alaska, or the Sami up in the Nordic Circle. Travellers here in Ireland, there is no history of the flu on, and I would love to do one if I could get the statistics to do it. But those groups again are being challenged by the current pandemic as well. So the centenary anniversary, in a way, turned out to give a really timely focus to raise awareness, and I'm really pleased that a lot of the medical groups listened very well to it. We all knew that another pandemic was just a matter of time, given recent epidemics like SARS, MERS, avian flu, and the 2009 influenza pandemic. And we also know that the next one is just a matter of time, as Mike Ryan keeps warning. One area of my own work that's been widely used is COVID memory, and in this one time, we're trying very much to capture them from people like medical workers, but also, the vulnerable people who work with the public, like postal workers or whatever, police forces, etc. I just want to look at 2 lessons from 1918 here. So next slide, please, there.
Ida,
Yep.
2 minutes, Ida.
I've really gone far too far, sorry. So one thing I'd look at is the forgotten pandemic. Historians were very focused on the war and revolution. Social history wasn't as fashionable as it is now. And death from infectious disease was really common. So people kind of ignored it. But I also think a big reason, and this is a really important one, why they didn't so much forget as deliberately subdue the memory. Next slide, please. So this is a really common findings with pandemics. Tommy Christian, who I interviewed, said when it's over, people wanted to move on. He said it kept coming in different waves. There was 3 waves of the 1918 flu in Ireland. And he said, we just wanted to forget when the 3rd wave, because it kept coming back and back. And we really need to be watchful for this, to ensure change still happens, or precautions for the next pandemic. We can't ignore the lessons that COVID is trying to teach us. Move on to the next slide, please. And then on to the next one after that, because I'll just go to the last one then. The second point is social inequalities and pandemics. Traditionally, historians of the 1918-19 pandemic said that it killed both the rich and the poor, but this man on the right, the left here, Sven Erik Mommeland from Oslo, his work on social inequalities and the pandemic in Norway disproved that myth. He found that people in smaller, more densely populated housing were more likely to die during that pandemic. But it seems from later research he did in 2017 that this factor was ignored in national pandemic preparedness plans. He surveyed all European pandemic preparedness plans and found that no plan included socioeconomic disadvantage. And this is true also of our own plan, which I looked at in, I think it's the 2006 plan. It didn't mention it anywhere. And indeed, it didn't mention 1918-19 except just in passing. So if you go on to the last slide then, please. And the next one after that, I think. And again, sorry. So my takeaway point is that while epidemics and pandemics in the past have prompted useful change in Irish and other societies, the history of the 1918-19 pandemic shows that sometimes society deliberately forgets rather than looking back to see what lessons can or need to be learned. In 1918, when bacteriology seemed to be finally winning the battle against infectious disease, this new virus caught them on the hop and taught them otherwise. And then, as now, we'd got cocky. We had come to think that such impacts in our world were a thing of the past. The cyclical thinking is that medicine has advanced us beyond those big impacts, and we can and should learn from disease and social history of disease. The next pandemic, as Mike Ryan says, is only a matter of time, and investment in healthcare and to combat social inequalities is not a luxury, it's a necessity to raise all boats. Thank you.
Ida, that was fantastic. That was superb. Great insight on the history and the learnings that we need to be taking from the current pandemic. I was particularly struck when you say that there's deliberate forgetting, and perhaps we can add to that by suggesting that governments will by themselves be reluctant to put themselves under investigation in view of the many mistakes that they will have made in the course of the pandemic. But nonetheless, there has to be some form of as you say, deliberate investigation in order to ensure that the learnings are taken for the next one, which is, as you say, only a matter of time. So who do you think would be involved in such analysis and reporting and investigation of the pandemic just gone, or as and when it is nearly complete?
One of the things I've been longing to do since last January was literally to pick up the book, run into the Minister for Health, Simon Harris at first, and just say, there are things in this, or if you read any history of it, not just mine, but there are things in any history of 1918 that will teach you and will help you to make decisions quicker because you know outcomes. Because even though society has changed and modernized, there are a lot of things that are still parallel. I had a lot of consultation from many medical groups, nursing, but this is the first political group that's ever asked me to speak to them. And
well, that's really shocking. That this is the first political forum for you to address.
Yeah.
It's
civil service needs to look at it. Everybody, history needs to be much more significant. And perhaps it's because for a long time we did the wrong sort of history. We didn't do social history. So much history was concerned with battles and national questions and things, but not so much with healthcare and the human condition.
Yeah. If any attendees would like to submit questions, there's a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And we'd be delighted to take them and put them to Ida in the short time that we have on the remaining part of this session. Ida, do you think that HSE is collecting the relevant data that will be needed for the investigations, particularly with respect to the socioeconomic discrepancies or inequalities that are prevalent in the people suffering?
Is doing a much better job at collecting data now than it was. I worry about the data that they're collecting or not collecting on long COVID, and the provision that they're looking at within their own staff to see of the impact of long COVID on their own staff. The nursing profession. I have many friends in medical roles who are affected by long COVID. Some of them have had to do things like drop grades at work because they can't perform such high-level jobs as they did before. I think they need to look much more closely at the impacts of long COVID. About 30,000 Irish people, it's estimated, have it.
There's one question submitted here, and I'll just read it out if I may. How do we ensure that social histories are accurate in relation to the numbers of persons who are impacted, in particular those with disabilities?
Well, it depends on the way the quality of data is collected in the first place, I suppose.
And
Irish data, healthcare data is traditionally quite weak. The Nordic countries would have much more detailed health data, and that's the reason a lot of historic research on things like 1918 flu are at a very high level from the Nordic countries.
And are there WHO standards that health agencies, health departments should be following with respect to the data collection?
That would be outside my area of expertise.
Okay.
But I would look at the kind of national statistics that would be published by, the General Register Office or things like that. And certainly in 1918 and more recently, we collect less data. Like, for example, it's really difficult to tell from the 1918 data how many children were orphaned. Well, we know lots were because I've interviewed lots of families of, who where the parents died.
Well, I guess
there was socioeconomic impact as well on those families.
Okay, I guess maybe HICWA might have a role to play in overseeing the processes engaged by HSE. There's another question here, Ida, if I can just put it to you. What are your thoughts on mandatory vaccinations and how we prepare for future pandemics when we have conspiracy theories at every turn that more and more people are falling for? When you provide actual evidence, they provide opinions with no evidence, and they think they're right.
Yeah, as a historian, I suppose I'm always trying to learn and to teach my students as well how to read and assess the kind of that kind of analysis that you get. One of the things I think that has been most valuable in Irish society, we have such a high rate of vaccine compliance. From early on last year, I was writing about trust and the importance of trust. And I think generally, you know, there have been flaws, but everybody was doing the best they had with the information they had available. But I was part of a group led by Professor Oisin O'Connell at the Buns in Cork, which he set up, which was a cross-disciplinary group with medics, politicians, different kinds of, you know, medics of all professions, politicians, one historian, and many members of the media and civil servants as well. And the idea of that was from very early, last March, I think it was set up, was to share high quality information very rapidly, both between those professionals and to get it out into the public through the media as quickly as possible. And I think we've had a very responsible media, whereas in some countries, obviously, we won't name the UK or the US, but they some sectors of the media haven't been so responsible and have scaremongered. Or maybe, but I think also compulsory vaccination is a very difficult thing because some people are too vulnerable to be vaccinated. And the idea of herd immunity is that we get it to a level where those people are protected in our society as well.
I have another, this one's an easy question. Why is the Spanish flu called the Spanish flu?
Because there was little or no reporting of the impact of the flu on the combatant armies. And even in some of the domestic countries, like Scotland, for example, there's very little coverage in the newspapers about the flu, loads here in Ireland. And so therefore, Spain, which was a non-combatant country, wasn't involved in the war when 3,000 or 4,000 of its courtiers and its king, Alfonso XIII, who was that vulnerable group, he was 32 or 33 years of age, young, strong adult, which is the unusual cohort hit by that flu. It hit their population. And it was widely publicized. So that's how it got the kind of misnomer Spanish flu.
Right. Another question here from a nursing student who unfortunately got COVID from nursing a patient. And she's come across a number of nurses who are just mentally exhausted and fed up due to this pandemic. Was this documented in the past during pandemics such as the Spanish flu? And should the government see this as a major issue down the line?
But they definitely should see it as a major issue down the line, because I've been working so closely with these groups, with nurses, etc. And I'm very well aware of the impact and the exhaustion, and my empathy to the person who's talking about it there. I mean, all frontline healthcare workers were at risk, and many of them are suffering now. And many of them have had to make economic sacrifices and have had their careers limited in the future, even though it's an awful thing to say now, because of that. And there's no cognition given to that, or no recognition given to that. In terms of research, one of the flaws with I would say my own work is that I came across very few nursing accounts, and that's just the Irish accounts had very little. The American ones and other countries have far more female voices in the archives. So one of the things I'm trying to do, and I'm hoping your nurse friend there, our nurse viewer will do it as well, is to promote the writing of things like diaries, but also of oral histories, places like the Royal College of Physicians and also the DU Oral History, COVID-19 Oral History Archive, or DCU, are really trying to make sure that there is a data bank for future researchers to work on. And it'll be very helpful. Even if you think of it, like I interviewed people in their 90s or hundreds about the flu, and the limited number I had was a really valuable resource. But if you can imagine somebody, perhaps that nurse indeed, who at 20 now could be 90 or 100, and people who didn't live through this time will be nursing, looking after them. And at least if there was that kind of data bank, they'd have some sort of explanation for what happened.
Right. Okay, well, listen, Dr. Milne, thank you very, very much. It's been a superb presentation, and I think there's an awful lot of food for thought there, and we should certainly learn from, as you say, the experiences of prior pandemics, and we should be vigilant to ensure that the appropriate learnings are taken from the current one, because as you say, it's only a matter of time for the next one. But I really do want to thank you most sincerely on behalf of the Social Democrats, and wish you well in your work, and look forward to reading more of your excellent research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and apologies for the PowerPoint issues.
Not at all, not an issue. Thank you very much. All the better for it.